Welcome to the Untold Tales Audio Anthologies. Written by Howard Loring and narrated by Melissa Del Toro Schaffner. Punching the Clock, or How to Change Totality. The bell was near to sounding, and the library's lobby was crowded with students. All were rushing, intent on reaching their next class on time. Most wouldn't make it. She saw him first, not a difficult thing, for he was easily a head taller than anyone else there. Then, while both of them were slowly edging through the throng, their eyes met. The red-headed woman understood at once that something was wrong. "What is it?" she asked, when they finally connected. Looking stern, he led her to a nearby bench where they sat. It was evident that he didn't know where to begin. She reached over and took his hands in hers. "What is it?" she said again, but softer this time. "We may have to postpone the wedding," he answered, as if it pained him to admit the possibility. This statement shocked her. Not the postponement itself, but rather why such an occurrence would grieve him so. The ceremony was perfunctory, and the date had been randomly picked, so neither much mattered to the bigger picture. After all, the details were unimportant. These two young and enthusiastic academics were deeply in love, and both knew they would be in each other's lives, whatever the circumstance. No, something else was on his mind. "Hank," she demanded of him, this time with a stern face, "tell me why you're so upset." Seeing her stark demeanor, at last, the agitated man focused and gave her a straight answer. "I'm sorry," he said. "I shouldn't be so dramatic, but the planning committee has summoned me, and they want to see me badly. I've a meeting scheduled in an hour." "The planning committee?" she slowly repeated, not understanding. And then she added, "Why would they do such a thing? Does it concern your thesis?" Here he nodded, but his words were not so positive. "It's all that I can think," he answered. "My advisor must have passed it up without telling me, and since they want a conference, they have to be paying attention. There's no other explanation. I'd have never heard from them if they had no interest." "But that's a good thing, isn't it?" she asked, still at a loss over his strange, agonized behavior. "Well, if they go for it," he explained, "they'd want to start simulations right away. And if so, I may not have any spare time in the romance department. The overall mission has multiple facets, and they'd all require extensive run-throughs. Lots of bugs would crop up, and naturally, each would have to be worked out." "Yes, I know," she gently reminded him. "For you weren't the only one with access to your top-secret dissertation." She used her fingers to indicate quotes while saying this. Then she noted, "I helped a little along the way, I think." He hugged her, relieved that she wasn't upset. "It wouldn't have happened without you," he stated with gratitude, whispering the obvious into her long red hair. "I'd have never gotten anywhere otherwise. Besides, all of your professional help, your confidence in me, never faltered, and that mattered." "Then why are you so troubled?" she asked him again. "It's not the wedding, Fran," he confessed, hugging her tighter. "It's the honeymoon. I haven't told you, but I had a surprise trip all planned and ready to go." At this, she laughed, not only in relief, but also in joy. She now knew that nothing was really wrong beyond said events needing adjustment, and more importantly, still, she again realized that her love for this unique man was not misplaced. "Hank," she said tenderly, as she pulled back to look him in the eyes, "you're easily the smartest person I've ever known, but you're a colossal idiot. We'll get through this. In the larger scheme of things, it won't matter at all." "Will you come?" he asked her, blurting it out. "Will you walk with me, I mean? And could you stay while I have the meeting?" Of course, she reassured him. I wouldn't miss it. I'm done today anyway. That's why I'm here. I was just double-checking some facts, and that can always hold. Great, he said to her. I'd feel better knowing that you were waiting for me. I'm glad I called your office. They told me on the phone that you were on your way over. Classes having sounded, the library's lobby was now near deserted. The two stood and exited, slowly heading to the administration building. It wasn't far. So, once the simulations are completed, she asked him, who would they pick to go? He shook his head and answered, first things first, Fran. Let's see that I'm not mistaken, assuming things that aren't really there. Could be I'm wrong about this. Then why would they want to see you? She wondered. He shook his head again. Got me, he mumbled. I've no idea. Then, in a louder volume, he added, the whole thing would be kept pretty hush-hush, you know. Not that the theory itself is secret. It's been published for over 2 years now. Oh, Hank, she said. Just think if it's true. Finally, a scenario that couldn't be altered. Everything would change then, and no one would even know the difference. That's the beauty of it, he agreed. But now that it may actually come to pass, I'm having reservations. This is no longer hypothetical, Fran. It could really happen. And naturally, she correctly surmised, you're concerned by what it could mean for us. Yes, he said gravely. But for everyone else, too. Should it even be attempted? Theorizing is one thing, but trying it is a different matter altogether. She took his hand, an uncommon action for her in public. Well, it's no longer up to you, she pointed out. The planning committee would have the final say. That's what they do. And as no such endeavor has been approved in ages, let's just wait and see, and we'll deal with it then if we must. In response, he only nodded. 10 minutes later, they sat outside the planning committee's conference room. There was still a half an hour until the scheduled meeting. Members of the group began arriving at intervals, all entering the venue across the hall without comment. Fran thought Hank would soon explode. He appeared calm as he sat beside her, but she knew differently and was judging how best to alleviate the tense situation. No way his composed demeanor would last another 30 minutes. Not a chance. Then, the situation changed without her having to decide.
Francis, what on earth are you doing here?
Suddenly asked an elderly gentleman who, after strolling down the hallway, had appeared unnoticed before them. Why, Professor Sykes, said the surprised woman. She jumped up. Hank also stood. The men, who didn't know each other, politely nodded. Fran was the common denominator of the trio. She quickly explained the connection between them. Professor Sykes is my department head, she informed Hank as the two men shook hands. Professor, this is my fiancé. I've mentioned him many times, I believe. Sykes raised his eyebrows at this declaration.
This is Hank?
He asked, pumping his arm more vigorously than before.
It's nice to meet you, young man, but I'm still at a loss, I'm afraid. Why are you two here?
He has an appointment, Fran answered her boss. The professor stopped shaking the taller man's hand, although he still held a firm grip on it.
You are Dr. Henry?
He asked him, amazed. And then to Fran he added,
Your fiancé, the infamous Hank, is in reality Lawrence Henry?
He then had a great belly laugh. To this, the pair smiled, but not making the connection, they failed to see the humor, for they didn't get the inside joke.
He's the one you were helping?
Sykes continued, although he already knew the answer. He laughed again.
Wonderful,
he cried.
Now I know he's got his facts in order.
But Professor, inquired Fran, still puzzled by the older man's appearance, what are you doing here?
Why, I'm the committee's chairman,
he related.
you're not aware of this, of course. The membership is strictly need to know, and our deliberations are sealed.
You, stated the now stunned Hank. Professor, excuse me, but I don't understand. How could you possibly be, given that you're not a trained scientist? The chairman laughed for a third time.
It's not surprising, really, he pointed out. Physics may provide us the means to time travel, its explanation and implementation and so forth, but that's just the beginning of the story. In the final analysis, what happens as a consequence will always fall within the history's purview.
I see, replied Hank, who suddenly did. Now, it seemed apparent, for every effort intended to correct the altered time flow instead had always changed things. Naturally, someone had to keep a record of what occurred in between the attempts.
The committee represents all points of view,
added the professor.
Nothing is overlooked, no one excluded. It is the bigger picture that we're after, the sum total.
May I ask, said Hank, if the committee accepts my theory? Sykes didn't answer. Instead, he looked to Fran. She worked for him, and the man respected her professional abilities, which were myriad and always consummate.
Are you sure of the intended reference points? He asked her. There's no doubt. You're confident the connections postulated are proper for each timeline involved.
She didn't hesitate. Of course, she said. That satisfied him. Yes, this could all work out very well, Professor Sykes now saw. He was, in fact, much relieved by this new, unexpected turn of events. Then, holding out his arm to lead the way, he said to Hank, "Shall we, Doctor? I think we may as well start the proverbial ball rolling. You'll excuse us, Francis." "Of course," she again replied, but this time grinning. The retreated pair were her two favorites. They crossed the hall and entered the committee's conference room. She sat and waited. It was still early, but the dozen or so members, both men and women, were already gathered around a large table. Each had a thick file resting before them, and a few of these were open to reveal the contents therein, many pages of which displayed detailed graphs or complicated diagrams. Hank recognized only two of the people in attendance. One was his former advisor, the current head of the physics department. The other, a renowned and well-loved maestro, directed the School of Music. Hank knew this, for he and Fran often enjoyed the university's excellent symphony, and the diminutive man was an unforgettable conductor.
"I see that all of us are present,"
announced the chairman, as he crossed to his designated space at the head of the long, polished tabletop.
"This is Dr. Lawrence Henry, the man of the hour,"
he added to the gathering.
"Please take a seat, Hank."
He did so, at the other end of the expanse, in the only unoccupied chair left in the room.
"This encounter comes out of the blue for you, I'd imagine,"
noted Sykes, who had the advantage of the committee's agenda.
"Yes, sir,"
conceded Hank, while glancing to his department head. He knew this woman well, for she was his boss as well as his mentor. Now, however, she didn't meet his gaze, being instead occupied by shuffling through the file before her.
"I now declare this meeting in session,"
Sykes began.
"And to bring Dr. Henry up to speed, I state for the record that the committee has been interested in his theory for some time. Further, as I just related to him outside, this assemblage represents all disciplines, so naturally, some comprehend the nuances better than others may."
"I'll be happy to explain things," Hank offered.
"No need of that at this point,"
was the reply.
"We're all conversant with your theory. It's just that some of us understand it in greater detail, as I've stipulated."
The maestro suddenly raised his hand, effectually halting the chair's ongoing oratory. "A point of order, Mr. Chairman," he said pleasantly. "I've a question for Dr. Henry, if I may. Something of a more personal nature, before we begin in earnest."
"Certainly,"
agreed Sykes. The maestro smiled, pleased his request had been granted. "Doctor," he began, "we've been informed that your theory is quite the departure from the standard model, and this fact intrigues me. While physics is not my area of expertise, I do know something of creativity, and wonder what was your motivation for this new breakthrough? What led you to even try to formulate such a uniquely based solution?" This thrust momentarily threw Hank. Of course, he had thought about it, and so possessed an answer to the inquiry. Still, he'd never voiced it aloud. "I'd imagine," he said, "it's because I have no direct personal bond with the past. That is, given it was possible, I'd have no family to lose. You see, I'm an orphan."
Ah, just like Francis,
observed the chairman, nodding his understanding. And then, by way of explanation to the others, he added,
His fiancée is Frances Newton, my best research assistant. She also has no living relatives. Is this not the case, Hank?"
"That's true, sir," was his answer, although we'd known each other for some time before we made the connection. "However, this will soon change, for we plan to marry. At least, that's the current plan. Of course, we'd become our own family then." "I see," observed the musician. "And my congratulations, young man. Thank you for indulging my curiosity, and also for being so candid in your reply. Indeed, it's very interesting to me that this natural detachment was your impetus." "Well," admitted Hank, "I believe it was at first. As I've said, it's what originally started me ruminating about a possible solution, that is. Once begun, it was then and only a matter of time of analyzing the many failures of the past and rethinking those attempts." "Of course," agreed the maestro. "Miss Newton is a wonderful historian," Hank emphasized, "and was a great help to me."
"Yes," confirmed Professor Sykes. "I can attest that she's a superb professional. And properly, we should begin this meeting by first stating the existent context for the record. After all, if the committee so votes, a fourth historical age may be instigated." "I'm sorry, sir," Hank interrupted, "but I don't follow." The chairman stood. He held a page from his opened file, but he didn't refer to it. Instead, he spoke extemporaneously as if he were lecturing, which of course he was. "The record of this planet's humanity," he began, "can be grouped into 3 main epochs, the first of which was the authentic, unaltered timeline before the point of the original rupture. The second covers all attempts that were made towards correction, none of which succeeded, while each only complicated the situation. The third, in which we now reside, encompasses the wars that resulted in the current moratorium placed on time travel, the very circumstance that this august committee may soon alter by virtue of today's deliberations."
"Yes, I now understand your reference," Hank then related. "But sir, technically speaking, if the theory is proved true and is indeed successful, a new historical age would not result. Instead, the original timeline, all of it from the very beginning, would be fully restored to the way it was before the first breach occurred." The maestro leaned forward after this statement. "You intend to say," he asked, perplexed, "from that point when the original timeline was initially breached, there's no need to go further back than that, surely? Not before that first incident took place, I mean." "No, that's incorrect, I'm afraid," said Abigail Grant, who was Hank's boss, the committee's physicist of record. "Second-era efforts towards restoration were often directed into the distant past, which once attempted naturally affected the original flow. As a consequence, essential connections were either not made or were made at improper points along the way. It was thought at the time," Hank explained, "that such attempts could correctly reset these missed linkages. Yet they never comprehended the larger technicalities involved. The idea itself was sound, but their approach was always flawed and therefore consistently doomed the outcome.
There is no original timeline, Sykes stated to the maestro. For now, it's been altered on numerous occasions.
He sat before continuing with,
All we have is the record of what it should be. The problem is getting there without disruptions to the flow.
As I've said, added Hank, the inherent parameters were not properly understood. The phenomenon itself had never been sufficiently described. Therefore, no solution was even possible. And from our point of view, these misguided past missions naturally complicated the entire scenario. I see, said the maestro. The resulting wars, you mean? No one spoke to this observation, all being familiar with that particular part of the record. The long wars had been devastating, and the terrible consequences still lingered. In fact, this was the sole purpose of the Secretive Planning Committee, for its unchanging mandate was civil improvement. In theory, Hank's theory could improve everything, and permanently. The big question was, would the protocol be sanctioned? The maestro needed clarification. You'll forgive me, Abby, the musician therefore said to the physicist. I thought I was on top of this. How can you possibly send someone back to the very beginning? As I understand it, doing so is precisely what caused most of the ongoing problems that we're dealing with today. That's the conundrum, agreed Grant. Going back by definition causes change. Yet to undo this change, you must first go back. Hank's theory solves this paradox. Yes, countered the maestro. I do understand the basic principle. It's the extent that surprises me. It appears that I was seeing only half of the picture, I'm afraid.
Perhaps an overview for the record, Abigail,
the chairman suggested to the physicist. Professor Grant nodded and complied by saying, as we're all aware, time itself exploded after the initial breach, causing massive change to the flow by blasting parts of the existing timeline into other eras. It was originally believed this mixing could easily be corrected by missions into the past, first to prevent the rupture and later to earlier points of the flow to head off the upcoming event. These attempts all failed. Yes, once again stated the maestro. So, how could you now get back without disruption? He asked. To the beginning, I mean, where you said you'd have to go.
The problem, the chairman stated, is ever cause and effect, as Dr. Grant has so elegantly explained. Travel to the past, to any point, causes more change. This modification will, by definition, be unpredictable, always resulting in unforeseen ripples passing through the timeline. Traveling to the point of the first blast, explained Grant, will not correct the changes currently present in the original flow. For now, they are part of the earlier record. Jumping back to the distant past in order to reset these changes does not work either, for such attempts only beget more unanticipated complications, as we've noted. That's why the Third Age was instigated, to halt all time travel, thus preventing further adjustments. Dr. Henry's protocol proposes another strategy, the chairman noted. It doesn't jump to the event itself, nor the distant past as all other attempted corrections did. Instead, it worms its way there, to the very first missed connection, by backtracking to that initial event from the more recent past, where only slight change will occur.
Again, I do understand that component, added the musician. The so-called Primus point. I'll leave that to those more qualified to judge. Yet I have other concerns about this theory that deal not with the process itself, but its broader implications.
All of us have qualms about that facet of the proposal, conceded Sykes. We'll cover that aspect after the summation, yet our mandate is clear. hence this meeting.
Again, there was a pause, for all were aware of their shared quest, unattainable until now. This decision could change everything. It was a heavy responsibility.
The new procedure, soon continued Grant, embeds the team into the flow during the last attempt. This would create only slight alteration, and given the unique nature of this initial jump, the next steps would cause no change at all. This time frame then becomes the Primus point, their permanently fixed home base.
You see, added Hank, by utilizing the standard machinery, all earlier teams returned, each ultimately causing paradox throughout the flow. However, these embedded operatives would never return. Neither would they take a machine, for we'd just send them there with our system. Grant said,
By co-opting the hardware assigned to the previous mission, equipment now in that time frame, the team could then travel to each earlier unsuccessful attempt one by one, resetting the needed connections to the flow as they went.
And there'd be no further disruption, surmised Maestro, for they'd be utilizing the machinery from this past mission?
Yes, Hank explained. The time portal is there, up and running, being used by the team from the Second Age. Employing this existing hardware, covertly of course, would therefore create no new changes to the upcoming flow. The needed corrections could then be made without fear of further repercussions. Remember that in order to succeed, lectured Grant, any team has to go back beyond the initial disruption. They must. If not, even if the first breach and the resulting wars are finally avoided, the original timeline would remain altered, thus inevitably skewing the future. Nothing would really change, for what then comes would still be tainted. Conversely, Sykes said, the new team would surreptitiously punch their way through the stream, as we've noted. This will cause no new changes to the flow. Once at the Primus point, using the path of the original missions, these time jumpers would then travel backward into each affected timeline, making the necessary corrections as they went.
Without disruption, said the Maestro, almost to himself.
Without additional disruption, Hank corrected him. You see, from our point of view, it's affected already, yet now no new changes would occur as no new mission is being launched. The missing connections could then be reset, step by step, by using the paths already created by the earlier attempts. Thus leaving no trace, mused the musician, louder this time. And no paradox, agreed the physicist. I see, announced the old man. Which brings me to another point, I'm afraid. Why would they have to remain in this new time frame, never to return?
Normally, as I've noted, answered Hank, teams use the standard machinery. When doing so, they are, by definition, under containment, which means they are shielded from the surrounding flow, and this has standing consequences. The operatives don't age in the embedded time frame. Yet, when they do return, added Grant, they once again age normally, and that fact has always caused inherent paradox within the stream. This must be avoided. Hank's protocol just sends them there, and without the containment generated by the hardware, this standing complication will no longer occur. So, they would age as usual? Inquired the musician. Because now they're permanently placed in this past timeline?
Hank nodded and replied. While at the Primus point, yes. But while using the machine to trace the earlier paths, they wouldn't age. They'd have containment then. Now the Maestro nodded, for, making his own connection at last, he understood this complicated mission component. Again, he leaned back in his seat. Professor Grant continued. Lastly, she summed up,
The effort must consist of at least 2 people, for the operations to the more recent past would have numerous problems to deal with. Once they work further back into the stream, things become less complicated, and only one time jumper would do for these more primitive attempts. The second team member would then remain at the Primus point, keeping an eye on things and assisting only if the need arises. After this, everyone else at the table nodded.
Very well, announced the chairman. Let's move on. Restoring the original timeline will have ramifications. Again, for the record, if you would, Abigail.
If the first age is successfully reinstated, Grant reported, then by extension, everything will change. The natural flow without the terrible wars will be re-established. No one can predict what will then unfold, for the future is always unknown. We may not be here, you mean? Asked the maestro. Well, answered Hank, all of us would be present in the reconstructed timeline once it reaches the point where we would naturally appear. But you are correct in the broader sense. Our circumstance would be altered. That's inherent to the procedure.
This is a grave step to undertake, declared the chairman, not to be accepted lightly. However, the many wars and their terrible aftermath would at last be avoided, and because these alterations would occur in our past, once done, no one in this age would even know the difference. For the third time, there was silence. All present were aware of the unique protocol's potential, heavy in the extreme. Still, each member of the planning committee was also conscious of the mandate vested only in them to set things right once and for all. The maestro again leaned in, crossing his hands before him. Then he looked Hank in the face. When the old man spoke, his words were softly uttered, but directly addressed. "You're willing to take on this quest?" he asked. "Yes, I can start simulations immediately," Hank answered. "The computer codes have all been written. The total process was covered in my thesis. You understand." Yet the poor maestro didn't understand. He wasn't the only one. Neither did Hank. "The simulations are completed," Professor Grant informed him. "I've been running them for almost 2 years now. I think it's doable. That's why you're here." This news stunned Hank. He was blindsided, taken totally unawares. But then, very quickly, the true meaning of the maestro's question sunk in. "You want me to go?" he almost sputtered. "This was only theory for me, just a puzzle to be solved. I'm certainly not trained for such an important undertaking." "Who is?" countered Grant. "No such endeavor has been attempted in a long time, not since the Second Age ended. You know the equipment. That's the important thing." After this declaration, the chairman slowly leaned forward, his fingertips just touching the polished tabletop. "Of course," he calmly added, his eyes now glued to Hank's. "You need a second team member, as we've just discussed." The young Dr. Henry easily made this connection. A great gift, no doubting that. Out of all humanity, after the protocol was instigated, he and Fran would still be together, no matter what changes occurred in the timeline. "There's also chaos theory to consider," dryly observed his mentor, as if Hank needed further inducement. "The fewer who know of this, the better. Recruiting and training someone else only exposes the mission to more variation. You know this." "Yes," agreed Hank, who did. "Shall we say within the week?" the chairman then asked him. "We wouldn't need to know exactly. You certainly hold full access to the time lab, after all."
"We'd be quite unaware in any case," added Grant. If your mission is successful, that is. I understand the implications, replied Hank. And yes, I'm willing. I also have the team's other member already in mind. Within the week should work well for us. How exactly would your team proceed? Then asked the maestro, who quickly added while looking to the chairman. For the record's benefit, you understand. As I've said, answered Hank, the mission's code is written. The time portal will be generated here and automatically closed just after we've stepped through. Lastly, the computer shuts down, pre-programmed to first delete any record of the jump. I see, observed the now satisfied musician. Thank you.
Any questions?
The chair inquired, but there were none.
Very well,
he next stated.
All that's left is the vote. Given this unique circumstance, I think Dr. Henry should remain for the committee's final decision.
In the hallway, Fran was still sitting and waiting. Without warning, the door across the corridor abruptly opened, and Hank came through. As always, with a glance, Fran correctly read him, and so she instantly knew the news was positive. Given his great height, only a few steps were needed to close the distance between them. She jumped up, and he bent over, and the two firmly embraced. He was so tall that even on tiptoes she barely came up to his chest. They went for it? She asked him, as they slowly swayed back and forth in each other's arms. In a big way, he answered her, and the marriage is on. We don't have to postpone it. In fact, we need to do it pretty quickly. At this wonderful news, she hugged him even tighter, and in response, he straightened, thereby lifting her off the ground. There is a change, though, he whispered into her thick red hair. I'll tell you everything, don't worry. What's important now is that nothing will be altered for us. What is it? She asked, unwilling to wait for an explanation. In response, he gently put her down. Then, standing to his full height, Hank suddenly looked glum. Next, he laughed, unable to hold this affected demeanor. Turns out, he said, my big top-secret plans for after the ceremony will have to be changed. That's unavoidable, I'm afraid. Still, I think you'll like the result. To this, she quickly cocked her head and, raising an eyebrow, without words, asked him for a more inclusive answer. Well, he therefore slyly complied. It seems that now we're gonna have one hell of a honeymoon. Thank you for listening. We love our listeners, fans, and patrons here at Untold Tales, and we hope you love the stories that we're bringing to you month after month on the first of each month. Please consider leaving us a review on Podchaser. As always, we love our listeners, fans, and patrons. Have a wonderful day and a happy, happy New Year.